We are live.
Cool. So thank you everyone who's joined in and welcome to this month's free lecture from INSTUCEN. And we're going to be talking about the Crusader States from 1098 to 1291 and what used to go on in that time of the world. Okay. So this is dedicated to the memory of my late teacher, Dr. Mahesh Kalra. Uh, okay. But before we start, I am not going to cover a basic history of the Crusades because dozens of books and hundreds of papers have been written. And a lot of them are now available online. Many of them are out of copyright. Okay. Many of them are available for cheap. I can share a few references in the group subsequently. Okay. What I will be doing, however, is draw upon art historical and numismatic sources to give you a kind of glimpse of the period and what contemporary people were thinking and picturized the period as. Okay. So we'll start with historical notes just to give you a brief introduction to what actually happened. And then we'll go into the more social economic history. Okay. So the Crusades all begin with this announcement by Pope Urban II on the 27th of November, 1095. Okay. He had received an appeal for help from the Byzantine emperor who was facing threats from the Seljuk Turks. Okay. Now, his motives for initiating this campaign, the Crusades would last all the way till 1291. Uh, and he had many complex motives, whether they were religious or political or social. Okay. So the problem all starts with Jerusalem. Okay. It used to be under the Byzantine Empire and before that under the Roman Empire. In 638, the second Rashidun Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, conquered Jerusalem from the Byzantines. But under the rule of the Rashidun Caliphate and subsequently the Umayyad Caliphate, there was a policy of tolerance because Christians and Jews were known as the Ahl al-Kitab in the Quran, that is, people of the book. And therefore, they were given Zimmi status and they were allowed to visit Jerusalem as pilgrims and also to take up residence at Jerusalem. Okay. Under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, Jerusalem continued to thrive. Okay. However, the Abbasids were sort of pushed out in this part of the world by the Fatimid caliphs. Okay. And in 1009, the Caliph Al-Hakim bi Amrallah destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the holiest church in Christianity because it is supposed to be where the uh, mortal remains of Jesus Christ are buried. But in 1009, in a war between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, when the Caliph Amrallah captured Jerusalem, he destroyed this church. However, his successor allowed Christians to rebuild the church and made peace with them. In 1071, okay, the Fatimids lost Jerusalem to the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Seljuk Turks brought a completely different sense of administration to their domains. Okay. They are a confederate lot. They are, with different Seljuk lords controlling different parts. They did not have the kind of centralized administration that the Arab caliphates had. Okay. And because of that, local governance suffered greatly, and there was often arbitrary taxation and harassment of pilgrims and traders to Jerusalem. Okay. Now, the Byzantine Empire that had lost Jerusalem a long time ago felt threatened by the Seljuk Turks because not only had they captured Jerusalem, but they were now advancing on Constantinople itself. Okay, so the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Komnenos felt that his forces were inadequate to take care of this threat, and so he sent an appeal to the Pope in Rome. Okay. Uh, so these Turkish attacks on Christian pilgrims had already been filtering through into Europe. And there was this general public sentiment that all the rulers must do something. Okay. And as so happens with rumors, by the time they traveled back into Europe, even the smallest of atrocities had been magnified manyfold. Okay. So the news coming out from Jerusalem sounded a lot more dire than it really was. So there was a certain amount of exaggeration also because there was some incentive for people to cause war on Jerusalem, and I'll come to that. Okay. Uh, so when Alexios's appeal landed at Urban II's desk, he saw an opportunity for many things. For one, he had just come out after the investiture controversy, okay, which had been a prolonged conflict between the Catholic Church and various secular rulers of France, Germany, England, etc., as to who will appoint bishops. The Catholic Church said it had the sole right. The king said that any appointments done inside our kingdoms has to be by us. Okay. This eventually finished in the Council of Clermont, and the Pope sort of came out rather weaker. So he wanted something that would again reassert his power as the leader of the Christian world. And he saw in the appeal of Alexios an opportunity to reassert his leadership. Okay, and so he called for the crusade. Okay, he also saw that this was an opportunity to do some house cleaning. What was happening is that Europe and especially France had gone through a large number of local wars and feudal conflicts. Okay. A lot of little counts and dukes and knights had been fighting each other for territory. They also had the concept of a tournament, which is knights would actually have death matches to see who was the braver, a more valiant knight, and that was killing Europe's elites, literally killing elites. And he thought all this violent tendency within the people could be challenged and channelized towards an external enemy, which in this case were the Muslim Turks. Okay, they had a sort of uneasy peace with the Arabs, but the Turks were sort of made of a different, cut from a different cloth, as the expression goes, and there was a worry. Okay. Now, why were there all these little civil wars? Is because of the notion of primogeniture, in which if a king or a duke or a count, that entire feudal order, when they died, their eldest son would inherit everything. The full kingdom would go to the eldest son, and the middle and younger sons would get nothing. And the same for a duke, the same for a count. Okay. That meant that these were young people always in need of land, in need of money. Okay. And these were people who were trained well with a sword and a lance and all that, which meant that there were always plots going on, where younger sons were trying to overthrow their elder brothers or adventuring in somebody else's kingdom, looking for land and property and money and all that. So why not, was the thought, that if he could get all of these guys to form an army and head into the Turkish lands, where then they can re-establish Christian control, and there they would get all the land and titles and everything that they wanted. Of course, you can't frame a war in these terms. Therefore, Urban II framed it as a just war, saying that if you went and fought the Turks and reclaimed the Jerusalem and the so-called Holy Land, because various important sites for the Christians were all located there. Okay, not only Jerusalem, but Bethlehem, then there was Antioch, there was um, Ascalon, many other sites. That are all the names that were there in the Bible. So he said, if you go there and you reconquer that for Christianity, you will get salvation and all your sins will be forgotten. Okay? Now, this caused a massive fervor in Europe as the call branched out into Europe. Remember, the call was given in 1095. Okay? And it took obviously several weeks for it to spread all across Europe. But there was major fervor in Europe. But the people who took up this call to go to Jerusalem and liberate it were not the nobles whom it was actually targeted at. Instead, it roused a lot of the peasants. And a lot of people abandoned their jobs, abandoned their farms, and started heading out towards Jerusalem. Okay? So large hordes of people, up to the numbers are not very clear, but it is said to be between anything from 3 to 12,000 people taken from many, many parts of Europe. Okay, so this came to be known as the People's Crusade. But, because so much religious mania had been aroused, they needed an immediate vent. Unfortunately, they found that vent in the European Jews. So the Jewish people living among them became the very, very first target of the Crusades. Huge number of European Jewish people were taken out of their homes and slaughtered brutally as enemies of Christ. Okay? As the People's Crusade progressed into Constantinople, it caused a lot of worry for Alexios I. Okay, he had expected a trained army of knights and soldiers to come to his aid to fight the Seljuks. Okay, instead was this huge number of untrained, you know, people whom he could do nothing with. And suddenly they were at his door and he needed to find shelter for them, feed them and everything. Okay, so he did the one thing that a medieval king could only think of, which was that he said he pushed them into Anatolia and he told them to go and meet the Seljuks on their own without any Byzantine help. He wasn't going to waste his army trying to protect them. Okay, these guys decided that they were led by Christ himself. So they crossed over into Asia and went into the Seljuk domains, where they were promptly massacred to the last man by the Seljuk armies. Not one survived to tell the tale. Okay. However, while this was going on, several crusaders did, finally form an army. And 4 years from Pope Urban II's call, in 1099, the Crusader army, okay, which had full of knights from France, England, Germany, Spain, Italy, and many other countries, okay, by ship landed in the Levant, okay, which is modern day Israel and Lebanon, and their armies made their way into Seljuk territory, conquering city after city, and finally they managed to capture Jerusalem. Okay. So here, after many, many days, after many years from that event, is an image on the walls of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where you can see Crusader graffiti. Okay, most of them were illiterate, even though they were elite. Okay, so as a mark of their presence, they would just carve a little cross into the walls. Okay, so when the Crusaders invaded, they founded a total of 4 states. Okay, the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which I will cover. Okay, a little on the lives of each of how these states came to be and how they ended. Okay, the first is the county of Edessa, which is right here in the north. Okay, and which is as far as can be from Jerusalem. Okay, so it was the first Crusader state to be created and also the first to be lost. Okay, so in 1098, okay, as the crusading army was heading towards Jerusalem, Baldwin of Bouillon, he felt that if he sticks to the main army, he's not going to get any of the spoils, because there were other bigger uh, lords in that army. And he was only the younger brother of one of those lords. So he felt that he was not going to get anything. So instead, he took his men and he broke away from the crusading army and marched on a town called Edessa. Now, there is a very curious story. It is said that he convinced the ruler of Edessa, whose name was Thoros, to adopt him as his son and to give his daughter Arda in marriage to him. Okay? It's not very clear how he convinced him. However, very conveniently for Baldwin, Thoros died rather soon after and left uh, Baldwin as the ruler in Edessa. Okay. Uh, Now, Baldwin and his successors were very pragmatic. Okay. Edessa was mostly an Armenian city, full of Armenian Christians. Okay, this is long, long before the Turks would overrun all of this area and essentially Turkify the whole region. So today the town, which is called Sanliurfa, is a Turkish majority town. But in that time, it was mostly an Armenian city. Okay? And Baldwin and his successors made sure that they would always marry Armenian wives and make sure that they were well um, entrenched with the local population. Okay, Edessa, as I said, was the first to be founded, but also the first to fall. And it had a rather short reign of 52 years. In 1150, okay, Nuruddin Zangi, who was the Atabeg of Mosul, so he was one of the Turkish rulers and ruling in Mosul. He found this sudden new large Christian state uh, an irritant for his own ambitions. So he made war on Edessa and captured its last ruler, Jocelyn II. Okay. As happens in all these medieval wars, many male Armenian Christians who were living there and had supported the Franks. So those days, all Europeans were called Franks. Uh, okay. They were hated because they had, these absolutely peaceful people were suddenly now disrupted by, these Franks coming in and causing havoc all across the Middle East. And so when Zangi did capture Edessa, the entire male population, who were mostly Armenian Christians, were lined up and slaughtered, and their women and children were sold into slavery. The disaster that befell Edessa became the catalyst for the Second Crusade. There were a total of 7 crusades over 2 centuries that the Europeans sent into uh, the Middle East, of which only the first and to some extent the third are considered successes. Now, how do we know of the, say, when you look at a historic map and you see the extent of a, a territory, how do you know that? Okay. So one of the ways is by locating the coins of that place. Okay, where all are coins of a particular ruler found? And accordingly, you can get some clue of their extent of their territory. Alongside, of course, various written accounts of the country and various other kinds of archaeological evidence. Okay, so the few rulers that it did have, these are their coins. Now, many of their coins are imitation coins of the Byzantines. Okay, and that is something we should remember. And this is what my teacher, Dr. Kalra, had taught me, that when a ruler changes, okay, it is not that easy to change the coinage overnight because people are used to a certain coinage. And if you strike new coinage and circulate it, they will not accept it all that easily. Okay. So the coinage of Baldwin I, for example, borrows metaphors from the Byzantine coins. So the ruler Thoros had been a vassal of the Byzantine emperor, right? And therefore Byzantine coins had been in circulation there. So the typical motifs are, this is a uh, bust of Saint Constantine with the halo there. And this is a cross motif. Okay. And Baldwin's initials are written there. Okay. Then they come similar motifs of Baldwin II, okay, of Roger the Salono, who was a regent for the minor king after Baldwin II and all that. But as soon as they collapsed, okay, the kingdom passed to Nuruddin Zengi. You will see here that while he was an Islamic ruler, these are not typically Islamic coins, okay, but these are imitation Byzantine coins again. Okay, because this area has only recently come under his rule. He is, respecting the population and continuing to issue Byzantine-like coins. So typical Byzantine coins had Jesus Christ or one of the Christian saints on one side and the images of the ruler and his queen on the other side. Okay, so these are called imitation coins, and many countries had this kind of coin. So that was the start and end of Edessa. We come to the Principality of Antioch. Okay? Antioch was a very important city for the Christians because it is said that Saint Paul, 50 years after the passing of Jesus Christ, had actually set up the first properly Christian community at Antioch. Okay, far from the uh, control of Jerusalem, where they could be Christians in the way that the emerging New Testament had laid out, where they could follow the teachings of Jesus without having to follow all the Jewish customs and not get targeted for blasphemy. Therefore, Antioch was a very important city in the sacred geography of Christianity. Now, in 1084, Antioch had been conquered from the Byzantines by the Seljuks. So the First Crusade made it a major target of those. Okay. It went through a brutal siege in the winter of 1097. Okay. However, the Crusaders were on short supply. Many of them were dying of exposure to the cold. Uh, so the stories that came out of there and that are then captured in various uh, histories and memoirs there. Okay, and one of the most important sources of many of these stories is a French manuscript known as Les Passages d'Outre-mer. Okay, passages from the uh, outer lands, or what are known as the Crusader States in history today. And these are almost like eyewitness reports. So many of the pages are very richly illustrated with handwritten documentation of what went on. So according to this, the siege was so brutal that the besiegers had to eat their own horses to survive. And then when they ran out of dead horses to eat, They even started eating the dead bodies of fellow Christian soldiers. Okay. Eventually, as summer came around and they got a little frustrated, uh, the the person who was leading this was Prince Bohemond of Taranto. Okay. He discovered that there was a guy called Firoz who had been a Christian but had been forcibly converted by the Seljuks to Islam. He didn't like it and he saw these guys as liberators. Okay. So he had been a watchtower guard and he let them in by the watchtower. And very quickly, the Crusader force entered the castle, overcame the local garrison, and captured the city. Okay. Now, since it had been captured by the Byzantines, one of the deals with the Crusaders is that they'll capture it and hand it back to the Byzantines. The Crusaders' thing was like, look, we did all the hard work. Okay, so we are keeping it. There were also certain racist and religious thoughts, which we will come to. Okay, so Bohemond crowned himself Prince of Antioch. Okay, Antioch lasted for some time. Okay, its majority population was actually made up of Armenian Christians. There were Syrian Christians who spoke Aramaics. There were Melkite Christians who spoke Arabic. Okay, so that was the majority Christian population, and there were a few Muslim and Jewish minorities. Okay, uh, a century and a half later, okay, uh, the Mongol Empire, okay, had come to the very shores of the Mediterranean, and they were beginning to threaten the rulers then. By that time, the ruler in Egypt was a person called Sultan Baybars, who was Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Okay. And the Christian states, okay, Edessa had long gone. The other Christian states saw this as an opportunity to sort of claw back some power, and they decided to make an alliance with the Mongol Empire. Okay. So in 1260, this prince made an alliance with the Mongols. However, the very same year, the Mongols advancing on Egypt lost a major battle to the Mamluk Sultan Ruknuddin Baybars. Okay, it is also apparently in history the first recorded battle in the Near East to use gunpowder. Okay, so Baybars had defeated the Mongols and they turned back, and he saw his opportunity to avenge himself on Antioch. Okay, so after a number of campaigns in 1268, finally he managed to capture Antioch. And the same story then repeated itself. Okay. By then, so many Christian atrocities had been built up in that area. The memory was still horrible, especially that of the sack of Jerusalem. That all, like in Edessa, all the Christians were slaughtered or expelled, their churches were destroyed, and the women and children were sold into slavery. Okay. Sorry, these are coins of Antioch, not Edessa. Okay. But again, you will see coins of Bohemond the first. Now, he issued two kinds of coins, which is sort of circulated in parallel. The first is the Byzantine style, where you can see there is a image of Saint Constantine here. But the second style of coin, which he also issued, was the Taranto style, which is what he was familiar with. So, we had the same cross on the other side. But on this side, he had the fleur-de-lis, which was his symbol at Taranto. Okay. Subsequently, somewhat more independent coinage evolved in Antioch. These are coins of Roger of Salerno and Raymond of Poitiers. Now we come to the third state, the county of Tripoli. Now, among the Crusaders, one of the most wealthy guys was a guy called Raymond IV of Toulouse. Okay, he was in contention to become the king of Jerusalem, but he lost the election because he was over humble, whereas the other candidate was rather very uh, extroverted. Okay, so he got so cheesed off that he said, I need to have some kingdom for myself. So he attacked the two remaining fortresses that were still in Turkish hands, Tartus and Tripoli. Tartus he got very easily in 1102. Okay. Uh, but in order to catch the port town of Tripoli, he decided to construct the citadel of Tripoli. So it's a massive citadel that that stands even today outside the port town of Old Tripoli. Okay, but while still building the castle, he died. Few years later, his illegitimate son Bertrand and his cousin William, they formed an alliance to, you know, complete the work, and they seized Tripoli. But after that, they started fighting among themselves as to who would be the Count of Tripoli. And eventually, Bertrand managed to get William assassinated. So this was the founding of the County of Tripoli. Now, it was nominally a vassal of Jerusalem, but for all practical purposes, it was independent. Okay. Tripoli managed to hang around for quite a long time, well after both Antioch and Edessa. Okay. But as happened with Antioch, in 1289, Tripoli had joined an alliance with the Mongols. Okay. And the Egyptian Sultan was not happy, and Baybars had come and gone. And the person who succeeded him was the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun of Egypt. He laid siege to Tripoli in 1289. He had a weapon with him that apparently the Crusaders had no idea what to do with it, and those were catapults. Okay. Now, the history is not very clear as to whether these were catapults in the old classical sense, okay, or they were actually guns. Okay. Uh, so the sources are not very clear. It is possible that because Baybars who preceded him had seen guns at the Battle of Ain Jalut, so it might be possible that Qalawun had actually brought guns to Tripoli. So it is said that under the barrage of the Egyptians, the towers of Tripoli collapsed quickly and the city fell on the 26th of April. And the same story repeated. The population was massacred, women and children were taken as slaves. Okay. Old Tripoli was razed to the ground. Qalawun actually built a little distance away a new town called Tripoli, which is the current town of Tripoli in Lebanon. Okay. So here are some coins of Tripoli as I was discussing. Now, as I said, the same principle appears again. Now, see, Tripoli had been under the Seljuks and the Fatimids and all. Okay. So when the Christians had taken it, the current currency circulating there were actually dinars of the Abbasid caliphs and the Fatimid caliphs. And so they actually issued these imitation dinars. Okay. So the coin is issued. So it's almost like a counterfeit coin. The coin is issued by the Christian ruler of Tripoli, but it looks like the coin of the Abbasid Caliph from Baghdad. Over time, then they came to issue their own coins. Okay. So on the right, you see what is known as a denier coin. Denier is French spelling of dinar. Okay. Which carries more Byzantine and Frankish depictions. Okay. Towards the end of Tripoli's period, you have very, very Frankish looking coins known as gross and half gross. Okay. But after the fall of Tripoli, you go back to Islamic coinage, and these are now coins of the Sultan Qalawun that are being circulated. Okay. Now we come to the most important kingdom here, the kingdom of Jerusalem. Okay. So, all the way passing through Antioch and Tripoli, the Crusaders finally arrived at Jerusalem in June 1099. Okay, but the city was well defended. It had strong walls, and the Turkish rulers had held out for quite a bit. Okay. Uh, Now, usually when you lay siege, the siege army is happy to sit it out, waiting to starve the people inside the city because nothing can go inside or come outside, right? So eventually they will run out of supplies and starve, while the army outside can raid the neighboring villages and all and feed itself. Okay. However, news started coming of a massive Seljuk reinforcement army marching towards Jerusalem. So they felt that they needed to do something fast. Some of the more daring people in the plan decided to carry out what is known as an escalade, which is put ladders close to the walls, climb them, and enter the city. Okay? It's a very risky maneuver because defenders on the walls can shoot arrows at you and kill you. But nevertheless, these guys managed to do it at dawn and took the garrison of Jerusalem by surprise. And on July the 15th, the whole of Jerusalem had fallen to the Crusaders. Okay. Uh, 7 days later, they held a council in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to choose a king for Jerusalem. As I said, there were three contenders. Okay, one was, of course, the guy who finally had to settle for Tripoli. The second contender was the Catholic Church itself. They said, look, it should be ruled the way Rome is ruled, by the Pope directly. There should be no king. Okay. But the Crusaders were like, no, we've not come this far to just hand Jerusalem over to the church. Okay. We are going to make some money and get some lands for ourselves. So among themselves, they chose Godfrey of Bouillon as the king. Okay. He was very extroverted, campaigned heavily for himself. And so he got elected king. Uh, Sadly for him, he died the very next year. So he was king of Jerusalem for a very short period. Okay. Now you have to remember his brother Baldwin I, who had actually a few years back gone over to Edessa and made himself count, thinking that he was not going to get anything. Okay. But when he heard that Godfrey had died, he quickly moved in. Okay. Uh, He had his financiers in the Italian city-states of Pisa, Genova, and Venice, and with the help, quickly consolidated his position and so made himself king of Jerusalem. So he got the biggest prize after thinking he would not get anything. Okay, he subsequently captured many port cities like Acre, Beirut, and Sidon, and established the kingdom of Jerusalem as the biggest, most powerful, and richest kingdom. Okay. He also got a lot of Franks, that is Western Europeans, and native Christians to settle in the city. Okay. So this is how the fourth state came to be. However, the massacre of Jerusalem is one of the most shocking events that happened and something that was remembered for centuries after. Okay. So when the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, they summarily seized all Muslims and Jews in the city, okay, without clemency, without anything, and massacred them, okay, because they said Jerusalem is the holy city of the Christians and it must be purified with the blood of the Muslims and the Jews, okay. So contemporary sources, okay, like William of Tyre's Historia, like the passages de Outremer and various other sources, talk of blood flowing in the city-state and the desecration of the holy sites. Okay? Numbers vary. Some say it could be 20,000, some say it could be as high as 30,000. Okay. And historians are still trying to figure out what probably a more realistic number is. Okay, because 30,000 would probably be the entire population of Jerusalem, which did have a significant Christian population. However, many Christians were also caught up in the general bloodbath and massacre, often because the Jews, Muslims, and Christians tended to dress alike, all of them in the Middle Eastern style. So, this has been analyzed by many people. And what was the psychology of the massacre? Why were the Christians so brutal, which triggered brutal reactions when, the Muslims finally got back? For one, the siege had gone on for like a month and a half. Okay. They were exhausted and starving on one hand. Okay. But they also saw this whole thing as a divine mission. In fact, there are a lot of paintings. And one of the documents, for example, the Queen Mary Apocalypse, shows that the Crusader armies were led by no one but Jesus himself. Okay, so that's Jesus holding in one hand a Bible and a sword in his mouth and the reins of his horse in the other. Okay, so picture of Jesus that will surprise you. You have never seen Jesus in such militaristic aspect. Okay? So when they actually captured Jerusalem, they saw it as a divine mission fulfilled. So they were religiously exuberant. It was absolute mania. Okay. And then there was all that anger built up from starvation. And they just absolutely took it out on the rest. Okay. It's staggering. Okay. Uh, Many Muslims had gone to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram al-Sharif, okay, to take refuge there, believing that no one will come and kill them in their own mosque. The Crusaders had no such sympathy or empathy. Okay? They barged into the mosque and slaughtered them inside their own mosque. The same thing they did with the Jewish population. They had taken refuge in their synagogues. The synagogues were locked from outside and set on fire, burning everyone inside. Okay? So it was not just a massacre in terms of numbers, it was also a massacre in terms of the absolute cruelty that was inflicted. Okay? And it had tremendous impact. Jerusalem was completely depopulated of its Muslims and Jews. Okay, the Eastern Christians, some of who were spared, however, were in for more trouble. So the Crusaders now imposed Latin Christianity. By Latin Christianity, I mean the rules and regulations and theology of the Catholic Church from Rome, which are very different from the kind of Christianity that are followed by the people in the Near East. Many of them are either aligned to the Armenian Church or the Syrian Church or the Greek Orthodox Church. And suddenly these people found that while their lives were spared, they had to deal with uh, a different kind of Christianity. Now, when you look at the coinage, it tells you a completely different story. Okay. And as my teacher used to say, there is nothing more secular than coins. Okay. Because you have to mint coins that the people will accept. You swallow your religious pride. You don't just mint whatever coin you want. So, in fact, at the seizure of Jerusalem, the coins in circulation remained imitation coins of the Ayyubid dirhams. Okay. Uh, and slowly then other European coins were introduced. There was even a special currency meant for use for pilgrims, known as the pilgrim denier. Okay. Jerusalem would remain in Crusader hands for just 88 years. Okay. In 1187, Jerusalem was reconquered by Saladin al-Ayyubi. Okay. The famous Saladin. Now, he had already been building up a major army in order to capture the territory. And there was a guy called Raamesh Gowri, quite a mischievous character. Uh, he had been raiding Muslim caravans. So caravans that passed from Egypt into Syria and then south into Arabia had to pass through the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And now there had been deals to give them safe passage, right? Muslims will not attack Christian caravans, Christians will not attack Muslim caravans, and neither will attack Jewish caravans. However, Shation saw that as none of his business, and he would very frequently attack Muslim caravans. Okay? And Saladin used that as an excuse to wage war on Jerusalem. On the 4th of July, 1817, there was the very famous Battle of Hattin, and the army of Jerusalem was completely destroyed at that battle. Okay? Reynald was captured and beheaded on the spot. Some people say that Saladin very personally beheaded this man. And on 2nd of October the same year, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. Okay? Unlike the other three cities, though, there was no general massacre. Okay? Christians were allowed free passage, safe passage out of Jerusalem, especially Frankish Christians. Okay? They were free to get out of Jerusalem and try and go back to Europe. Okay? Jews and Eastern Christians were spared and allowed to continue living in Jerusalem. Okay? Uh, However, Saladin's capture of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade. Okay? And the Third Crusade had better leadership from Europe, okay, because it had the kings of England and France and Germany there. And Saladin was defeated in two battles in 1191 at Arsuf and 1192 at Jaffa. Okay. Because of which the Crusades managed to recover most of the coast. Okay. But they made a very conscious decision not to try and capture Jerusalem again. And why, I will come to that in the second part of my talk. They just negotiated with Saladin that as long as Christian pilgrims got free, safe travel to Jerusalem, do their rites and come back, they would be okay not waging war in Jerusalem. And both Saladin and the Crusaders agreed. Okay. And that would be the arrangement for a century. Okay. But again, you know, political situations had changed, and the new Sultan of Egypt, Ruknuddin Baybars, who was now trying to fend off the Mongols from his border, could not tolerate these Frankish guys who were aligning with the Mongols, and therefore the new kingdom of Jerusalem, which was based in the port town of Acre, was overrun, and on 18 May 1291, the last of the Crusader states finally disappeared from the map of the world. Okay, so this is a short political history. Again, coming to the coins of Jerusalem, which you will see. Okay, this is a beautiful imitation dinar, but because the guys who were making it were Franks, they did not know Arabic. Okay, so the Arabic that is seen on the coin is actually total and complete gibberish. Okay, so while those were the first coins, when they are more established, kings like Baldwin and Amaury and Reynald, they start issuing more Frankish looking coins. Okay, real talk really starts here. Okay, and that is to look at the social, political, economic things of the Ultraman. Okay. The first thing that they tried to do was that since they had depopulated it of its Muslims and Jews, they tried to encourage Latin settlements. So, and over the 200-ish years the Crusader States lasted, about 140,000 peasants from Europe were encouraged to settle there. Now, that is a fairly small number. They were given a lot of incentives like land grants, tax exemptions, and protection under the church. Okay. However, these peasants had a lot of challenges because long distance migration was one thing. Okay. Climate challenges were another thing. Okay. The Levant's climate is nothing like that of Europe. Plus, there were repeated conflicts because the Seljuks were not willing to, just swallow their loss. The Ayyubids were not going to tolerate them. The Mamluks were not going to tolerate them. So there were repeated conflicts. It was a dangerous area. Okay. So instead, the number of peasants who were expected were a lot less, finally, who came to the Levant. The people who actually did come were, as I said, the lesser nobility and knights, who came there because they were expecting, significant territories, getting large estates in service of more senior lords and all of that. Also, a problem was that Europe was in the system of serfdom those days, that if you were not born to nobility, then you were a serf, which means that you were sort of tied to the land. You were owned by your lord. You were property. And for many of these lords, letting these serfs leave and go and settle in the Levant meant that the kind of slave or free labor that they were getting would be lost. And so these guys were not willing to let go of property unless, you compensated them. You had to give them either more money or you had to find new serfs to work the land. So that was mostly an impractical idea. So the Frankish settlement of the Crusader states was essentially a non-starter. So instead, they were driven to look at the native population. Okay. Now, they brought wholesale their feudal system into this place. So, those at the top were set up as kings and princes. Then they had a number of counties under them. Those counties had a few lordships under them, and so on and so forth. So this, for example, is the lordship of Ulta. Okay. Uh, of one of whom was this fellow, Reynald of Chatillon. Okay. And he had a number of, see, these are all the major towns that lie on the caravan route between Egypt and Syria. Okay. Controlled by this massive fort known as Al-Karak. Okay. So this is one of the largest lordships, but it was also on the eastern side of the Jordan River, mostly all desert territory. Okay. On the western side, which is more fertile land, you had smaller estates, but more fertile, more productive estates. Those were further subdivided. So, counts got estates, then the counts divided their territories into little estates controlled by the knights and all. Also, a large amount of land was handed over to the military orders, who are a different economic factor. We'll come into that. So, while they brought their feudal system, they also brought the entire social stratification that they were used to in Europe. Okay. So, there was a small European, or, the word used in those days was Frankish. There was a small Frankish ruling class at the top, at the top was the king of Jerusalem, then were the princes of Antioch, the count of Tripoli and Edessa, and then various other counts and knights and all that. So, which was a very smallish, not more than a couple of thousand Frankish elite. Okay. Under them, with sort of semi-middle class status, were the local Christians, the Greek Orthodox and the Armenian Orthodox Christians. Okay. They had slight privileges because they were Christians. Okay. But all the high offices, important offices of state were all held by Latin Christians. So career prospects for the Greeks and Armenians were not that many. Okay. Uh, the Muslim population who was there came at the very bottom of the uh, hierarchy. They were pushed into rural areas and small villages where they often worked as landless laborers. Okay. But now, this hierarchy was taken very strictly. Just because you were a Latin Christian did not necessarily make you safe. In fact, there is a rather gory story of this famous guy. This Reynald of Chatillon is perhaps one of the most dreaded villains of the entire crusading period. Okay. He wanted land that belonged to the church and was not about torturing priests to get his way. Okay, and this is a miniature of Chatillon torturing a priest called Amory. And finally, Amory was very badly brutalized, beaten, stripped of all his clothes. His skin was all red. Then he was, painted with honey and left in a tower so that it would attract insects and they would bite him. And after enduring all this suffering, Emery just gave under and said, "You just take what you want," and things like that. So Chatillon's reputation was quite nasty. Not only was he attacking Muslim caravans, but had no respect for his fellow Christians. Uh, but that was Chatillon. But in general, Muslims and Jews got the stick end of it. Okay. Muslims were mostly forbidden from public worship. They could not do their namaz in streets. They had to do it at home. No Friday prayers were allowed. Okay. Uh, Now it depended on the kind of ruler and how stable it was. In periods of conflict, Muslims were usually rounded up and jailed somewhere because they felt that these Muslims would collaborate with Muslim rulers in Aleppo or Cairo or Damascus, etc. In other periods of stability, because they needed agricultural workers, they were sort of given more freedom like that. Okay. Conversions were not enforced. So, they did not like force Muslims and Jews to convert to Christianity. And there's a reason for this. It isn't that they were tolerant or secular or anything. Okay. But they could impose a terrible tax known as the poll tax. It was a tax for simply being Muslim or Jewish. And as long as you paid that tax, they'd let you be. Okay. And now the danger was that if you converted to Christianity, you'd stop paying the tax. And that poll tax actually became a very important source of revenue for all these lords. So they had a huge fiscal incentive to actually obstruct conversions. So while the church was like keen to, save all their souls and make them good Christians, the rulers were like, that doesn't work, bro. Then where will we go for money? Okay. Now this is a very interesting policy because it mirrors what the Umayyads and Rashiduns had also done in the past. They had imposed a tax known as the jizya, okay, on all the Christian and Zoroastrian populations that were there under their empire. Because again, forcing people to convert to Islam meant that this source of revenue would dry up. So for all their atrocities, they had a financial incentive not to force them to convert. Of course, this again varied. Some rulers were crazier, more religious, some were more stable. Okay. Uh, Now, the Eastern Christians under the Crusaders, okay, uh, had it had a very mixed experience. Now, because they were Christians, they were sort of spared. the atrocities that the Muslims and Jews had to undergo. However, they were also seen as the wrong kind of Christian. Okay? Because they were not, their rights and customs were not the same as those of the Roman Catholic Church. The Greek Orthodox had their own customs, the Armenian, Syriac, Coptic Christians, all of them had different customs. Okay. Now, when the Crusaders came to their lands, they had initially welcomed them because they thought that these guys would liberate you from the arbitrariness and harassment of the Seljuk rulers. Okay. The Crusaders were also like, we need to get settled in these areas and we need the help of these guys. So at the very start, they were like both were sort of distantly respectful of each other. Okay. However, the moment they sort of entrenched in power, they very quickly made sure that all the church appointments, okay, because they also had to, give the Pope his due. They made sure that all the top church appointments, so all the major churches, the priests were replaced by Latin priests. The bishops of the Eastern Christians were replaced by Latin bishops and all things like that. So the Eastern Christians found themselves becoming second degree citizens in their own land. They weren't, they weren't as worse off as the Muslims and the Jews, but they were not equal with the Western Christians either. Okay. They were seen as lesser Christians because they were inferior, schismatic. Okay. Their doctrines were different from that of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. And in part, they were also treated the same way as Roman Catholics. So they also had to pay the same poll tax. Okay. The choice was again clear to them. You either sort of convert to the Latin rite and then you're spared the tax, or you carry on your religious freedom and you pay the tax. So this created a sort of running paradox between the church and the secular rulers. And these people were caught in the middle. Okay. Few of them did have some autonomy, but as I said, they had to pay to retain this autonomy. Now, the Crusaders were also heavily, you could say, racist or religionist or communalist or whatever. Okay, they knew that the Armenian Syrian Christians whom they were dealing with, as well as some of the Jews and Muslims, who were craftsmen, who were merchants, who were farmers, they needed all these people to keep the economy going, right? Because these were the people who would also facilitate trade with all the Muslim territories in their neighborhood. Because they were the ones who spoke the same language. All of them spoke Arabic, they spoke Aramaic, they could speak Turkish, they had linguistic and cultural connections. So they needed these guys. But nevertheless, they were segregated. You couldn't live along with the Franks. So this is a map of the old walled city of Germany. This is actually a colonial period here. But you had a Jewish quarter, you had an Armenian quarter, you had a Christian quarter, and a Muslim quarter. Now, this is in the British period, which is 19th century. But in the um, period of Christian rule of Jerusalem, there was no Jewish or Muslim quarter, but the Franks and the Armenians and the Greeks lived in completely separate quarters. They were not allowed to mix. The Muslims and Jews had to actually live outside the gates. Now we come to the economy, and this is really the sort of reason why all of this happened in the first place. With a very detailed map of various trade routes connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. Okay, and you will see that a major choke point for the Asian trade to Europe and back and to Africa passes through this area. Okay, whether it is the sea route coming via the Red Sea or the land route coming via Persia, Iraq, and here, they met here. Usually, They would all converge at Constantinople and then move into Europe, which meant that the Arabs and the Seljuks here and then the Byzantines here really had the bottleneck of the trade. And therefore, the prices would get terribly inflated, and the Europeans were paying up to 12 times as much for what was actually being purchased in China or in India. And two of the main European trading cities, okay, which is Venice here and Genoa here, wanted an action of the pie. They wanted to cut Constantinople out. Okay. And they figured that if you could actually run your ships to the Outremer and back, okay. But this area was controlled by the Byzantine Navy. So they actually were the first ones to fund the expected expeditions. And so when these Crusader states were created, many of them had, they borrowed a lot of money from the Venetians and the Genoese. So to be able to pay that back, they had to give exclusive right to those guys to trade at their ports. That means the land route coming from India and the sea route coming from India, which merged here, finally passed into the hands of Venetian and Genoese peasants, so merchants, and then passed into Europe, cutting Constantinople out. Okay? Which obviously Constantinople was not pleased with itself. I mean, these people were supposed to have come to your help, and now they're kind of hitting you where it hurts the most. Okay? So the economy of this place now was fairly complex. Okay. The natives who had been landowners and who had been doing their own thing, were now forced out of their ownership. They became tenant farmers on their own land, or they became even landless sharecroppers. And the land was controlled by these foreign European lords. Muslims and Jews were completely denied any property rights. Okay. Although some of the more trade-dependent cities like Acre and Tripoli had a few more relaxed rules, because otherwise then there was no trade happening at all. Okay. Now there was a difference. See, with the merchants of Genoa and Venice understood this whole cosmopolitanism, the need to be tolerant and all of that. The landowning guys who had come from interior Germany, interior England, Spain, France, etc., they only understood, more land, more tax. Okay? They didn't understand trade and all of this. So they were actually happy to sort of let the Venetians and Genoese run that for them. Okay? The other aspect of the Crusader states economy was sponsorship by the Europeans. They had taken heavy loans. Okay, and they realized that they weren't earning much in their lands to be able to pay back those loans. And they needed a constant supply of money and men from the Europeans. Now, the church, who had instigated the whole thing, because it wanted, again, Christian control of what it called the Holy Land, was obviously only too happy to support them. So it would regularly send out missives to kings and counts and dukes and all of them to, send more money and more men to be able to protect the Holy Land and all. So the church's demands were so incessant. And by the way, if you refuse to agree to the church's demands, then they would just excommunicate. And that could make life difficult for you, because that was a period when Europe was very, very deeply religious. It's also called the Dark Ages of Europe, by the way. So the kings who were forced to donate to the church came up with, you know, even more exploitative taxes on their own people. So one of the most famous taxes is called the Saladin teeth. Because of the Second Crusade's defeat at the hand of Saladin, when they had to mount the Third Crusade to try and hit back, they actually imposed a tax in many European countries, raising money exclusively to go and fight Saladin. So it has famously been called the Saladin teeth. Okay. Now, there were a total of 7 crusades. And, every time a crusade army would come, there would be a temporary boost, because there were some fighting men, there was a lot of money and all of that. Eventually, all of that would get spent in fighting with, the Seljuks, the um, Abbasids, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks and all. And so this basically made this whole exercise completely unsustainable. Okay. Trade still remained their mainstay. But as I said, these lords really did not understand trade. It was only the Venetians, the Genoese, and to a smaller extent, the peasants who understood this. Okay. Now they were kind of, as long as they controlled the land, they were okay to let caravans pass through, because all the things that Europe was buying, silk, cotton, spices, glassware, various other luxuries, were all coming from either India or China, okay, which had to pass through the Arab or Turkish lands, okay. They would come to some of the ports here, Antioch, Tripoli, Tyre, Acre, Sidon, a whole lot of other ports here, and then be shipped over to Europe. The alternative was that if you were a bit of an idiot and tried to, harass the Muslims, Jewish, or Eastern Christian traders, then they would all simply go via the Seljuk realms into the Byzantine realms via Constantinople. And that the Venetians and Genoese were not willing to tolerate. Okay. So part of the whole rationale for the Crusades was that the Europeans wanted to control these trade routes and make sure that they weren't paying through their nose. Eventually, when the Crusades failed and control of these regions remained firmly within Arab and subsequently Ottoman hands, is when that whole exercise of colonialism started, with the Europeans trying to find a sea route to India and bypassing all of this. But this is where it starts with the Crusades. And that's why from an Indian POV, it's important for us to understand this. Okay. We in India might think why this was, this is something that happened in a distant part of the world. And how does it concern us? But it does concern us, because it was really the whole dream was to capture this area and then go looking for cheaper Indian material, cheaper Chinese material, and all that. Okay. The people here were the Italian city-states, okay, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Okay, they had the most money because they had cornered a lot of the trade and countered the Byzantine Empire. So as the guys in the Levant kept needing more ships, more soldiers, more money, the Venetians, especially the Venetians, but to a smaller extent the Genoese and the Pisans, were in a position of extracting more concessions out of them, like for example tax-free trading privileges. Okay. They even had territory in ports like Acre, Tyre, Jaffa, which was entirely within their political control. And they also made it clear to the Crusaders that while you love a good fight and you're hungry for land and you're always looking to conquer some more land, if you start fights and disrupt trade routes, then we will not give you more money. Okay, which is one reason why the states never really expanded beyond the initial phase. The other part of the economy was agriculture. Okay, now most of this area is dry and arid, and uh, the most profitable agriculture really is pastoralism. Okay, herding sheep and um, getting wool and meat out of them. But next to that, the coastal regions like Antioch and Tripoli had weather where had what you call Mediterranean weather, where you could grow olives, wines, grains, and all. So that those were the granaries of the entire Outremer. Okay, in Edessa, the upper reaches of the Euphrates and Tigris were important for grain production, but the quick collapse of Edessa also left the remaining states rather short-staffed. Okay. Manufacturing was another thing. Okay. These were places that over the centuries had built up tremendous prowess in manufacturing, in textiles, in metalwork, in various other things. Unfortunately, the Crusaders had come and disrupted all of that, because part of it was in their religious zeal. For example, in the slaughter of Jerusalem, so many artisans were killed that its economy never really revived. Okay. But one of the things that was much prized was Damascus steel. Okay. The best swords and lances came from the Damascus steel, which is basically Indian steel, especially from South India, called wood steel, which is shipped as ingots into uh, the Levant. And Damascus had emerged as a major place where ironsmiths would then convert these steel ingots into the most cherished swords. Another thing that the Crusaders learned was to, you know, uh, the damask textile style became very popular in Europe, also comes from Damascus. Okay. And there was something called the surcoat that kept you warm. You could wear it over your armor and you could embroider your coat of arms on it. So that's what the Easterners were wearing, but the Westerners adopted that and then it became a very popular fashion style in Europe. So in the years of exposure, they did get exposed to a whole lot more cultural items, and the impact of the Crusades on European culture is a lot deeper than we understand. Okay. As I said, by which you probably now up to your ears with this Gyan, but the Crusader states did derive a lot of income from tolls and tariffs. Okay, one is because they controlled all the ports, so everything coming into the port, out of the port, had to pay a tariff. And if you were not Venetian or Genoese, then you had no privileges and you had to pay the full toll, right? Apart from levying heavy taxes on the local Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians. So eventually, as I said, overall, the balance of the economy left them very terribly unsustainable. Now, one of the major reasons for conquering Jerusalem obviously was pilgrimage, right? Because the pilgrim rites were the first, the call given by Pope Urban II was to protect pilgrims. And so an absolute tourist industry, completely developed. And there were hostelries for pilgrims to stay. There was food supply for pilgrims. Okay. And there was a major industry of false relics. Okay. So very, very pious pilgrims would come and they would be sold all kinds of false relics. Okay. Fingers from Jesus Christ's own fingers, fingers of various saints, the actual nails with which Jesus was hammered to the cross, and various things like this. Okay, so there are quite a few relics all over Europe. Okay, even the Shroud of Turin and things like that that originated from the tourist industry here. So pilgrims were exploited shamelessly. Okay. And the last aspect of the economy was raiding caravans, which we've already mentioned. Okay. And this guy keeps coming up again and again. Okay. However, too many raids. See, some kings were wise and they understood that if you raided people, then the Muslim kings will react. Some kings were dumber and often raided caravans because they saw these riches, they were too tempting for them. Okay. And it's often remarked in multiple histories, especially written by Arab historians, uh, that the kind of things that the Arabs saw as daily life, to the Europeans, these are appeared as luxuries. Okay. Luxuries like fresh fruit, luxuries like food preserved on ice, luxuries like cotton clothing. And therefore, the temptation to raid caravans was often too high, in spite of all the dangers. Okay. So this was the socio-economic status of the Crusader states. Now we come to a feature that was very unique to the Crusader states in that this kind of stuff has never been seen again anywhere in the world. And that is the military orders. Okay. So these were orders created within the church, and there were four major orders. The Knights Hospitaller is the only one surviving to date. the Knights Templar, the Order of St. Lazarus, and the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. Now, these were basically created within the church. Okay. So you could join the church and then you had to take vows of celibacy and poverty, which is the regular Christian vows. But you didn't have to serve as a church father, you had to serve as a fighter for the church. And some of them, those who came from the nobility were knights of the orders, and those otherwise you were foot soldiers of the order. But these gave a tremendous career track for people who wanted to gain prestige and power. Otherwise, you were going to be locked as a serf for a low-born person in Europe. Instead, you could join these orders and go make some name for yourself and go and live in some level of comfort in the Middle East while you were fighting the Muslims. Okay, over time, these orders came to hold extensive estates within the Crusader states. But also because they were allied to the church, they were not answerable to the local kings, which sometimes created tensions between the kings who were, you have such a huge estate, but I can't touch any of that revenue because you are aligned to the church. So they were often self-sufficient. They were far better managed than many of the estates managed by the nobles. They raised livestock, they raised their own crops, they produced goods. Okay, so they contributed significantly to the economic output. Okay, the hospitalers, their name itself was, they were to set up, they were called St. John's ambulances, now of their name. And because they focused on healthcare, they set up many hospitals there for pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, and in return received a lot of donations, which made them one of the richest bodies there. And many kings did get jealous of them. Okay. But the ones who got really rich were the Knights Templar. Okay. Now, again, a nice parallel. Just as Buddhist monasteries in India, became very prosperous by creating sophisticated banking tools, so did the Knights Templar do that. So while they were supposed to fight, to protect Christians in Europe and pilgrims in the Middle East, they also developed very sophisticated banking systems. So in fact, what would happen is if you are traveling from Europe to Outremer, you wouldn't have to carry money because, then there was a risk of piracy or robbery. Instead, you would just deposit your funds in a Templar property in Europe. So these were called temples. And when you came to Outremer, you would have a little credit note and then you could withdraw the money there. Right? And they also offered a lot of credit because they had a huge amount of money lying with them. And many Crusader states, as well as mainland European states, came to depend on them. Okay. And one of the states that became very heavily indebted to the Templars was France. The King of France was deeply in debt to the Templars, but also because they had so much money, they had become very powerful. And therefore, over time, they started having tensions with the church. And Philip II of France saw this as his opportunity. And he attacked the Templars. And in 1307, he, captured and burned a large number of them because church people cannot be beheaded. They can only be burned. So, he said that they were denying Christ, that they were, he accused them of indecent kissing, worshipping idols, and homosexuality. And so that was the very brutal end of the Templars, okay, at the hands of their own people. Okay, but these orders had tremendous influence. In fact, one of the most famous Crusader castles in the Middle East, which is also a World Heritage Site, is the Crac the Chevalier, which was owned by the Hospitallers. So it was a private hospital comfort. Okay, these orders are also far more disciplined as fighters. And therefore, they were heavily relied upon whenever there were wars to be fought, which were very frequent. Also, because they were allied to the Pope, they were the ones called upon whenever there were disputes between the lords. Okay. So, there was a certain distant respect that they had, and the respect was shown to them not just by the Franks, but also by the Byzantines and the Muslims. Okay, because of their independent power, their discipline, and everything. Okay, they were also seen as people who would not cut deals with the Muslims, and which was literally the main reason why the church set up these fighting orders, because the church was also aware that secular rulers would dump the interests of the church over, when their private interests were. So they would run risks of cutting deals with Muslim rulers, with Eastern Christians, and all that. And therefore, they had these military orders to make sure that their Christian goal was never forgotten, which made it difficult for everyone there. Okay. So these are the ruins of the castle of Belva, okay, where the Templars and Hospitallers had played a very decisive role in halting Saladin's advance. So he was stuck for 5 years, handling the bravery of these. So actually, at Hattin, when he won, he made sure that the Templars and Hospitallers paid the heaviest price. Okay, the entire captured army of Templars and Hospitallers was beheaded. Okay. Now come to the Outremer and their relation to the Byzantines, which were rather complicated. They did have an initial alliance, right? Because Alexios, as I said, he's the first one to actually call them for help. But the deal was that, you'll recapture my lands back for me, okay? And I'll give you money, military support, supplies, guides, everything. Now, while the Crusaders accepted the deal, one is they were going there because they were told by the Pope and the Christian hierarchy that they were going to get land there, which were not, which, their elder brother was cornering in Europe. Now, how am I going to capture land and then return it to the Byzantines? Why would I do that? That doesn't serve my interest at all, right? I'm risking my life for some other guy. Absolutely not happening. Secondly, they also saw the Byzantines as, being lesser Christians because they followed different Christian rites. So they were not quite sure that, will I go to hell or heaven for helping these guys who are not exactly the correct kind of Christian? So essentially, an initial alliance very quickly spiraled into major gaps. Okay. So in 1098, like for example, when Antioch was captured, Alexios expected that it be given back to him, but Bohemond refused and instead crowned himself Prince of Antioch. Okay. And similarly, all other Byzantine claims were disregarded. And that's how the Catholic principalities of Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem emerged, which tremendously irritated the Byzantines. Okay? But they felt that instead of one army, which is the Seljuks at my back, now I have two. Okay? And that these guys are not only going to, well, they'll keep the Seljuks apart, but they'll also try to take over my kingdom. Okay? And that was not was not a baseless fear. So over time, what happened was they came to a little uncomfortable arrangement where the Byzantines focused on keeping the Seljuks from their realms and the Crusaders from keeping the Seljuks at their realms. So the one good thing that came out of it was that the Seljuks were now fighting a two-front war. They had the Byzantines on one side and the Franks on the other. So the Seljuk progress was kind of halted. But it did nothing for the Byzantines. Okay. But Byzantine fears came true uh, in the Second Crusade and later in the Fourth Crusade. Okay. When the Second Crusade was called, now the Second Crusade was called because of the fall of Edessa, and the Byzantines had nothing to do with it. But as the Crusader armies were crossing over from Europe into Asia, the then Emperor Manuel I did provide assistance to them. Okay. Unfortunately, the Crusader armies just looted Byzantine cities as they passed. And Manuel I was very upset. And Crusaders, in fact, said that you're Greek, we can't really trust you. They thought that he was secretly negotiating with Muslims. Now, diplomacy. Okay. When such things happen, Byzantine Emperor said, okay, let's try and be pragmatic. Let's build marriage alliances. Maybe something else would come around. Okay. And so there were intermarriages. Unfortunately, though, the Crusaders didn't really keep up to their side of the bargain. And the Byzantines' absolute worst fear came true during the Fourth Crusade. Okay. As I said, see, Venice had rivalry with Constantinople over the entire Mediterranean trade. Okay, by the time of the Fourth Crusade, Venice had these crusaders uh, in the firm grip because they were the ones giving them ships, they were the one giving them money. And Venice said, look, I need my price, and my price is Constantinople. You get rid of my worst rival. Okay. So, under obligation from Venice, instead of targeting Jerusalem, which was the whole point of a crusade, the Fourth Crusade actually targeted Constantinople. The Crusader ships landed at Constantinople, destroyed the city, burned it, threw out the Byzantine emperor and installed a Roman Catholic emperor. And then they tried to Catholicize the Greek Orthodox population. Okay, it's a short-lived period of a little under 56 years, but 56, 57 years. It's called the Francocratia among the Greeks. Okay? They see it as some of the most terrible times in their lives. Okay? But because of this, any possible alliance between the largest, richest, biggest Christian kingdom, which was the Byzantines, and the rest of the Crusaders completely collapsed. Okay? When the Byzantines got back their kingdom in 1261, they said, we'll have absolutely nothing to do with these guys. And just 30 years later, the absolute last of the Crusaders disappeared from the Middle East. Unfortunately, it left the Byzantines weak themselves, and they would barely last a century and a half themselves. Okay. So, it now come to the very end of the Uttara. So, why did it collapse? Okay, you already seen. One was because there was severe political infighting. Instead of forming one kingdom, they had formed four. Okay. There was a lot of infighting among them. Okay. Now, every time somebody arrived from Europe, he wanted more land and title. And the people already there in the Middle East, who were called the Pulens, they said, where are we going to give you anything from? Okay. So, new Crusaders and old Crusaders fought among themselves. Okay. Over time, key leaders, the bold ones who would set it all up, had passed away. And the existing leadership was petty and not capable. And of course, the fall of Jerusalem had come as a massive blow to them because then they had never again regained it. Okay. Now, 7 crusades happened, and after 2 centuries, Europe essentially got bored of it. Okay, the kings had other things to deal with. They had been throwing money at the crusades, and nothing was coming out of there. The riches were all going to Venice and Genoa. The French and the English and the Spanish and the Germans were getting nothing. So they got bored, they stopped sending money and men. Okay. Now, these guys were also religious nuts ultimately. I mean, looking from a perspective of the 21st century. But they had strict policies on not hiring Jews and Muslims to their armies as their armies were depleted and there were no one coming from Europe. Their armies were shrinking, which left them weaker and weaker. Okay. But because of its dwindling reinforcements, sorry, not swindling, because they had to keep fighting wars, then their economy was also getting drained maintaining those armies. And because of the kind of relationships they'd made with the surrounding Eastern Christian and Muslim kingdoms, meant that when Latin support finally dried away, these guys had no leg to stand on. Okay. On top of it, as we've seen the whole mess with the Byzantines, okay, that support had also vanished. And these guys had been critically dependent on the Byzantine navy to protect them from the navies of the Seljuks and the Egyptians. And with that also gone, their trade routes were severely exposed. Okay. The actions of raiding and pillaging, right, had also, one, irritated all the Muslim rulers around them. Secondly, severely disrupted trade routes, and merchants wouldn't dare go with their caravans because they were afraid of these idiots. That means trade dwindled. These raiders needed to be fed, which means they were ravaging the local farms. So all of that made a complete mess, and eventually they got, so they were already militarily isolated. They also got economically isolated. Okay, but their actions had killed their own economy. Over time, then with the loss of Antioch, with the loss of uh, Tripoli, as one by one the states fell, the control of ports had also dwindled. And, you know, and the loans that they were borrowing from Italian city-states meant that they had to keep trading away privileges to the Italians. So, more and more money was flowing to the Italians rather than to them. And the whole thing became so unsustainable that the states completely collapsed. Now, in 1144, Nuruddin Zangi had captured Edessa, right? So while that was a major psychological blow to the Crusaders, it was a huge boost to the Muslims. Okay. Right behind him came his own subordinate Saladin, who would eventually go on to, depose the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo and establish the Ayyubid Sultanate of Egypt and Syria. His victories at Hattin and Jerusalem meant that uh, most of the Crusader threat had been uh, neutralized. He also, like the Crusaders kept calling upon this Christian piety, that it's a Christian moral duty to come and fight them. Before him, the people who were facing these guys had treated it yet another war. That it was just. But Saladin said, no, this is jihad. If they are fighting for their faith, we are fighting for ours. So this has sort of created another moral motif. Okay. After Saladin came, he had established a sultanate in Egypt, and the sultans that came after him sort of took it as their business to finish the job. And Sultan Baybars and Sultan Kalaun systematically targeted the remaining territories. Okay. And when the town of Acre fell in 1291, the last presence of the Crusaders in the Middle East had vanished. Okay. Today, absolutely all that remains of the entire Crusader states is this one villa in Rome. Okay, so this is called the Villa del Priorato di Malta. And today it is the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller. The, the order is still around. Okay. It's a voluntary membership order. It's more of a time pass club right now than anything else. But it issues its own passports and it has diplomatic relationships with many European countries and all of that. But this is the absolute last standing piece of the Crusader states in Rome. And with that, thank you. Happy to take your questions.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for that lecture. There are
Thank
few
you.
questions in the chat box. Can I
Yes,
read
yes.
them to you, or can you access it?
Baldwin IV is the faceless king. Why do you call him the faceless king? Rahul, are you still there? Can you allow them to unmute?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think he's not there. Raymond ruled over Karak Castle. Yes, I showed that. Another spur castle. Nice pick of Crack the Chevaliers. Thank you. Thank you, Choitali. Thank you, Salil. No questions?
Sir, this is
Yeah.
sir.
Yes.
To answer uh, why Baldwin IV is called uh, the one behind the mask is because I believe he had leprosy and he used to hide his face behind the mask.
Yes, Baldwin the leper. That one you're talking of, no?
Yeah,
The second. Yeah, I know. His death sparked a terrible succession crisis, and essentially, the kingdom of Jerusalem was faced without leadership, and that is when finally,
okay.
uh, Saladin could move in. It's a complete mess that last 15 period. Multiple kings and princes laid claim to the throne of Jerusalem and made a solid mess out of it. Yes, Clarence, I see your name. Thank you, Renuka.
If there are no questions, I would request Ramesh sir and all the participants to switch on their camera so that we can have a quick selfie.
Sure. Are
Uh,
there
I,
any questions on YouTube by chance?
I'll just check.
Salil asks how much was the impact on trade with India? It was pretty negative. The whole exercise completely disrupted trade, and a lot of Indian goods just stopped going to them.
Sir, there are no questions on YouTube.
Okay.
So, are we ready?
Yeah.
I think so. Smile. Just a minute. Smile again, please. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ramesh sir.
Thanks a lot.
And there was this one comment on YouTube by Suchitra ma'am. I think the lectures will be there on YouTube, so they can access
Yes.
it anytime.
Yes. There's a question from Renuka Devaya. Was all trade done with local coins? Not really. There was a lot of Venetian and Genovese coins also used. But usually internal trade is done with local coins, which is why you have to preserve the sanctity of the coins. Which is why many Christian coins were actually looked like Islamic coins. But the local people will not suddenly accept a foreign coin.
Thank you, Ramesh. This was very nice, very informative and enlightening.
Thank you. Alan sir, shall I call it an end?
Yeah, I'm ready to close the stream.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So should I end the session?
Yes, you can.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you and
everyone.
good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.